Hi everyone, let's learn psychology with me. Today we will learn about the neural basis for cognition. Let's get started. In this chapter, we will talk about Capgras syndrome, the study of the brain, sources of evidence about the brain, the cerebral cortex, and the brain cells. Capgras syndrome. What is that? In Capgras syndrome, the emotional processing is disrupted, leading to an intellectual identification without a familiarity response. Confusion and weird speculation why a loved one has been kidnapped may happen in people who have Capgras syndrome. What is the neural basis for Capgras syndrome? Studies done from PET, positron emission tomography scan, MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. MRI tells us about the brain structure, while fMRI tells us about which portions of the brain are specifically active during the scan. Damage site in Capgras patients. The damage in the temporal lobe, specifically on the right side of the head, disrupts circuits involving amygdala. Have you heard about that? Well, amygdala is an emotional evaluator. Amygdala detects stimuli with threat, danger, positive stimuli, good feeling, and safe. Brain abnormalities in the frontal lobe, specifically in the right prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is active when we are doing tasks requiring planning or careful analysis, and it's less active when we are dreaming. What happens to the Capgras patients? The Capgras patients are unable to identify what is real and what is not, leading to weird beliefs, including delusions. What do we learn about Capgras syndrome? You can see here on the right side the picture of the lateral view of the brain. Here you see the pink color here, it's frontal lobe. On the right side, you see parietal lobe, and then occipital lobe, temporal lobe, as well as cerebellum and other parts of the brain. Amygdala is located in temporal lobe on this side, the yellow color here. Amygdala is important to support the feeling of familiarity. It helps people remember emotional events. It plays a role in decision-making, especially for decisions using emotional evaluations. Emotional evaluations work separately from the evaluation of factual information. Many different parts of the brain are needed for a simple task. The study of the brain. Human brain weighs around 1.4 kilograms. Male brains weigh 10% more than female brains. Different parts of the brain perform different jobs. The brain damage in Phineas Gage led to severe personality and emotional problems. Phineas Gage is a person used in brain researches. Brain, hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Hindbrain. Hindbrain is located at the very top of the spinal cord. Hindbrain controls life functions, for example, heartbeats and breathing rhythms. Hindbrain maintains body's overall tone, body's posture, and balance. The largest part of hindbrain is cerebellum. Damage to these causes problems in spatial reasoning. Midbrain. Midbrain coordinates movements. It relays auditory information from ears to areas in the forebrain where the information is processed and interpreted. Midbrain regulates pain experience. What about the forebrain? Forebrain. Cortex makes up 80% of the human brain. The crumpling that produces the brain's wrinkles or convolutions that cover the brain's outer surface. Longitudinal fissure runs from the front of the brain to the back, which separates the left cerebral hemisphere from the right. Frontal lobes form the front of the brain. The central fissure divides the frontal lobes on each side of the brain from the parietal lobes. The bottom edge of the frontal lobes is marked by the lateral fissure. Below it are the temporal lobes. Subcortical structures. Subcortical structures have three parts: thalamus, hypothalamus, and limbic system. Thalamus is actually a relay station for nearly all sensory information going to the cortex. Hypothalamus, which is located below it, that's why it's called hypothalamus. Hypothalamus controls behaviors for biological needs, for example, eating, drinking, and sexual activity. Limbic system. Limbic system has three things here that we should remember. Amygdala for emotional processing, hippocampus, and both amygdala and hippocampus are essential for learning and memory. Lateralization. What does it mean? Lateralization means two halves of the brain work together. The functioning of one side is integrated with that of the other side. The integration is possible because of the commissures, thick bundles of fibers that carry information back and forth between the two hemispheres. The largest commissure is the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. Lateralization. There are medical reasons to sever the corpus callosum and some other commissures. For example, this surgery was used as the last resort for extreme case of epilepsy. The person then becomes a split brain patient. Still has both brain halves, but the communication between the brain halves is limited. The research about this provides evidence. For example, many aspects of language processing are processed in the left hemisphere, while some tasks related to spatial judgment are lodged in the right hemisphere. Some elements of creativity depend on processing in the right hemisphere. The two halves of the brain work together, with each hemisphere contributing to the overall performance. Many complex skills depend on the whole brain. Source of evidence about the brain. Neuropsychology is the study of the brain structures and how they relate to brain function. Here are the data from neuropsychology. Clinical psychology, the functioning of intact, undamaged brain by means of scrutiny of cases involving brain damage. A lesion or a specific damaged area in hippocampus produces memory problems but not language disorders. A lesion in the occipital cortex produces vision problem but not other sensory modalities. Data from neuroimaging provides structural imaging, generating detailed portraits of the shapes, sizes, and positions of the brain's components. CT scan or computerized axial tomography scan was the primary tool for structural imaging. PET scan or positron emission tomography scan was used to study brain's activity. MRI, magnetic resonance imaging scans, relies on magnetic properties in the atoms that make up the brain tissue. It provides structural image. fMRI scan or functional magnetic resonance imaging scan provides functional imaging. It measures the oxygen content in blood flowing through each region of the brain. It offers a precise picture of the brain moment-by-moment activity. Neuroimaging. The results of structural imaging by CT or MRI scans are relatively stable. They change only if the person's brain structure changes, for example, because of an injury or tumor growth. On the other hand, the results of PET or fMRI scans are highly variable as the results depend on the task the person is performing. fMRI scan can be used to determine which brain sites are activated when someone is making a moral judgment or solving a logic problem. Data from electrical recording. Neurons communicate with one another via chemical signals called neurotransmitters. Electroencephalography is a recording of voltage changes happening at the scalp that reflect activity in the brain underneath. This procedure generates EEG, or electroencephalogram, a recording of the brain's electrical activity. Combining techniques. A brain area called the FFA, or fusiform phase area, is especially active whenever a phase is being perceived. There is a correlation between a mental activity, perceiving a phase, and a pattern of brain activity. The question is FFA needed for phase perception? Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. TMS creates a series of strong magnetic pulses at a specific location on the scalp. These pulses activate the neurons directly underneath the scalp area. TMS can provide important information on the functional role of that brain area. Localization of function. It's an effort to figure out what's happening where within the brain. Localization data are useful because brain scan tells people with Capgras syndrome that they have damaged amygdala. The localization of function shows that amygdala is involved in many tasks involving emotional appraisal. This helps and tests our claim about the syndrome and claims about the emotion role in familiarity. The cerebral cortex, that's a very important thing here. What is cerebral cortex? Let's look at on the left side first. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer that lies on top of your cerebrum. What is cerebrum? What is cerebrum? Let's look at the picture here. You see a brain picture here. On the top part, you see cerebrum, the brainstem, and cerebellum. Cerebrum. This region of the brain includes the cerebral cortex and several subcortical structures, including the hippocampus and basal ganglia. Hopefully, the picture helps you to understand more about the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex. Let's look at the explanation here. The cerebral cortex has three parts: motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas. Motor areas. Motor areas are the departure points or the primary projection areas for signals leaving the cortex and controlling muscle movement, and arrival points, primary sensory projection areas for information from the eyes, ears, and other sense organs. Both areas are called primary projection areas. Contralateral control. Stimulations to the left hemisphere leads to movements on the right side of the body and vice versa. Sensory areas. Information from the skin senses projected to a region in the parietal lobe, which is somatosensory area. An area in the occipital lobe, the primary projection are for vision. The primary projection area for vision. Sorry for the typo. How about association areas? It makes up 75% of the human cerebral cortex, can be subdivided into functional and anatomical grounds. Some lesions in the frontal lobe produces apraxia, disturbances in the initiation or organization of voluntary actions. Other lesions in the occipital cortex or parietal lobe lead to agnosias, disruption in the ability to identify familiar objects. Other lesions in the parietal lobe produce neglect syndrome. The individual ignores half of the visual world. For example, if that person eats, he or she eats only half side of the plate, just the left or the right side. The individual ignores half of the visual world. Aphasia, disruption to language capacity. Damage to the frontmost part of the frontal lobe causes problems in planning and implementing strategies. Damage to frontal lobe causes confusions if a remembered episode actually happened or was imagined. Remember, cerebral cortex has motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas. Brain cells. Brain cells have neurons and glia. Glia actually means glue in Latin or Greek. I have to check that out. But actually, glia means glue. Glia guide the development of the nervous system in the fetus and young infants. Support repair if the nervous system is damaged. Glia control the nutrients flow to the neurons. Glia provide layer of electrical insulation surrounding parts of some neurons. The insulation increases the speed with which neurons can send their signals. Glia constitute their own signaling system within the brain, separate from the information flow provided by neurons. Let's talk about neurons now. Neurons have three parts: the cell body, dendrites, and axon. You can also see the picture here on the left-hand side. You can see dendrite, neuron, microglia, oligodendrocytes, myelin sheath, synapse, axon, and astrocytes. Neurons have the cell body and dendrites. So dendrites receive signals from neurons. Dendrites look like a tree here. Axon. Let's see axon here. The output side of the neurons. It sends neural impulses to other neurons. The synapse, which is also part of the brain cells. You can see here the picture of the synapse on the left-hand side. Synapse is the gap and the receiving membrane of the next neuron. Synaptic gap is the space between the neurons. The bit of the neuron that releases the transmitter into the gap is called the presynaptic membrane. The bit of the neuron on the other side of the gap is called the postsynaptic membrane. Specialized glial cells are wrapped around the axon, creating a layer of insulation called the myelin sheath. That's it for today. Thank you for learning psychology with me. Good luck and see you next time.